Welcome to the Missionaries Podcast. Stories from the mission field for everyone, for you to listen, learn, and enjoy. Your host for today is Martin.
And welcome everybody to this new podcast. This time we're going to talk about discipleship as a missionary. And we want to say welcome to our very, very, very special guest of today. It's Kent Stetton. Kent, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Nice to be here, Martin.
We know each other for quite a while, since 2018.
Right.
Well, I've got a picture of you standing in front of a stage in a church in Warsaw in 2018. So it must have been then.
I think so. And then we had a run-in in Portugal. Pretty important run-in there, I remember. Yeah. Kent is actually the pastor who married us on the beach in Portugal. So that was quite special, to say the least. Yay! It was way fun.
Yeah, it was. Hey, you're married to Debbie?
Yes, sir.
Debbie, well, as far as the internet goes, and you never know if that's correct, she is office administrator at Crossview Community Church. That is still correct? That is correct.
Yeah, she's awesome.
But I looked you up, and this is actually quite funny. You're still working as an interim pastor in Darmstadt, Germany.
Yeah.
Well,
and
that's not true.
Yet I get no paycheck from them. That was a while ago, right?
Yeah,
right.
that was a while ago. Yeah, and then I found some other info on you that you're still on a sabbatical in the UK. Well, that's
I wish. Sometimes I wish. Yes, it was a great experience. But now we are in the great Northwest of the United States, in the middle of Washington State, and I work with an organization called the Northwest Baptist Convention, which has about 500 churches. Southern Baptist churches mostly, and I am in Region 5 of the Northwest Baptist Convention for those taking notes. And we oversee, my job is a church health catalyst, and I try to help churches be the healthiest they can be. And I'm also a church planting catalyst. So those words catalyst mean, I don't really do anything. I just encourage those who are doing things to.
Well, that's quite a job.
It's fun.
Yeah, that's quite a job. I mean, and I did see, I still have to figure out what it is. You've got a Master of Divinity. What is that, Kent?
Yep, quite divine. If I am in the sun just right, you can see my halo. The Master of Divinity is typically what guys who want to go into vocational ministry as a pastor pursue. And it's kind of an old term, but that's why I went that direction.
So in 2023 language, you're a pastor.
I'm an ex-pastor now.
You're an
yes.
ex-pastor.
Right.
Do you still preach now and then?
Quite often, actually. When I go visit churches, which is about every other week, often I'll get asked to share. Yeah, and I enjoy that. But we say I'm part-time for the NWBC, and that allows us to. I don't have to do all the other things that a real pastor has to do, that are very important.
I mean, it's quite a job. In all honesty, I don't see me ever doing that. I mean,
you'd be great, Martin.
And it's. You'll have to be. I mean, being a pastor is one, but you're also a shepherd. You've got to do all sorts of stuff that are, I mean, as far as I can see it, humanly almost impossible to combine it in one person. I mean, it's quite some fun.
Yeah, not to make light of it, but it is a tough gig, and it'll chew guys up and spit them out if they don't stay really close to the vine. Just the same for missionaries, same thing, if not more so.
Yeah, we get one of our mission goals is we were running a retreat for missionaries and for pastors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, which is not good news. It shouldn't be needed. But sadly it is. It's quite a demanding job. It's quite a rough one. I mean, if you're the pastor, And the same goes for missionaries. If you go to a country where there is no church at all, and if you're a church planter, where do you find your own spiritual food? You can't go to church since there ain't no church.
Yeah,
and
I love what you guys do, and even the creator of the cosmos, Jesus, had to get away quite often with his Father, and I think what you guys do is maybe the equivalent to a degree of allowing pastors to get away without feeling guilty about it. And self-leadership is one of the toughest kinds of leadership there is, and I really applaud missionary couples or pastor couples who do take advantage of retreats such as what you guys do, because you have to keep refreshed and renewed. So keep up the great work.
A lot of stuff that we actually do is, at least if I look at it, it's like, well, some of them are in need of therapy, so that's pretty heavy. But some of them are in need of just relaxation, a simple conversation without, we're not part of their missionary team. We're independent, so they can say whatever they want. If they want to jump up and down all day, hey, I'm fine with it. They can visit whatever museum.
Which is actually a great segue in a way to the topic. Martin sent me a couple of questions before this podcast, and one of the questions was, what mindset do missionaries maybe need, or pastors need, when you have to start with mission work, or maybe what's not a good mindset that'll disappoint you in the long run. And I think part of the reason that Martin, you and Esther are doing what you are doing is the need for refreshment and renewal by these guys. And my comment to that question is, having been a missionary, we were overseas for about 8 years, and you go over with a lot of lofty goals. And I think the reality is that if you don't have someone in your life outside of who you work with, you're going to be in trouble. And the problem with many pastors and church and missionaries is the people they struggle with the most are those they're working the closest with. And so it's difficult for them to confide in them and open up with them. I think that's especially true for pastors' wives and missionaries' wives. They can't talk honestly and openly with almost anyone in their missionary organization, because it's often about the people who are giving their husband a hard time. And the opposite is true as well. For husbands to talk about the hard time that coworkers are giving their wife is really hard. So I would encourage people to really take honestly in a way that in the Western church anyway, we're not honestly very good at doing. And that is having a very close discipler in your life, that there's mutual benefit to it. But especially guys, we're from America anyway, we're Lone Ranger Christians a lot of times, and we're not a very tribal society. And we miss out on so much that the intimacy brings, to be able to open yourself up to other men in a way that often you have to go away to a retreat center to do, is difficult for us. So that's one thing I would really encourage folks on the mission field or thinking about missions or pastors, is to really work towards having someone or someone's in your life that you can get just raw and open and honest with. And that is not an admission of weakness. It is a demonstration of strength. If we think that Jesus going away and praying all night showed that he was having an emotional, mental, spiritual breakdown, we would be sorely mistaken. And I think the same is true for the mission field. We have to work hard to have people in our lives that we can go to. And some people will say, well, I can just do like Jesus and just go straight to the Father. That's true, but Jesus and God had a pretty special relationship. And interestingly, Martin and I were just talking about this, it took Jesus 30 years before he began his public ministry. And what was he doing? He was learning how to have that kind of communication with the Father. He focused, as far as we know, almost exclusively on learning obedience and having that relationship with his Father. So missionaries, pastors, if you do that, then maybe you don't need a personal discipler.
Just for my curiosity, you've been a pastor for a gazillion years. I mean, you're getting old and gray. You're even getting bald.
Thanks, Martin.
Yeah, you're welcome. You know how I am. Always flattering.
What are friends for? That's right.
Yeah,
brother.
I know. How do you get your spiritual food as a pastor? I mean, if I need my spiritual food, the most easy way is go to church on Sunday, listen to the sermon. Hey, that's interesting. That's a great topic I never thought about. So at least once a week, somebody tickles me with a topic in church. But if you're a pastor, you're the one who is up in the pulpit. So,
Right.
so how do you make sure that you get your own spiritual food?
Yeah. That's such a loaded question, Martin. I think, in general, I think the Western Church, anyway, does set church members, Christians, up for believing that's where you should get your deepest, richest, meatiest food is on the Sabbath. And I think just the opposite is true, that your time with the Lord one-on-one, or maybe with your spouse during the week, is the meat. And then the Sabbath celebration is just that. It's a celebration of what God has been doing and showing and revealing to you throughout the week. And so I would strongly encourage, and we all know this cognitively, we know that we need to spend time in the Word, but interestingly for pastors, when we preach a sermon, we have been wrestling with that all week long. We have been getting beat up, if you will. We have been getting convicted or encouraged by the Lord all week long. And that's good in a sense, if you allow it to be a personal time with the Lord. But often the temptation is, this is for my congregation. This is for my parishioners. It's not for me. And what unfortunately adds to that is, after the sermon, we are hoping that people who just heard me for 30 minutes or so will be just as moved and just as corrected and encouraged or passionate as it has taken me all week long to get through that same message. So it's really a recipe somewhat for disaster if we don't allow the bulk of our sermon preparation, the bulk of our ministry to be personal growth, personally convicting me moving forward. We're eventually going to get empty, and we'll be leading from something else besides the filling of the Spirit. But the second part of that would be, again, Jesus was pretty awesome. He was able to do it on his own, but the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament, he had his very close friends. He had Dr. Luke, he had Timothy, he had Barnabas, who encouraged him, at least until the whole John Mark debacle, right? And Paul knew the strength, as passionate, as strong, as outspoken, as gung-ho as Paul was, he still needed men in his life who would walk alongside him. And I think we miss out on that somehow. We think that's like I said, an admission of weakness. And so I think it's so important to have men in your life who you can call anytime. I asked a group of pastors the other day, how many men in your life are 2 a.m. men? And they kind of scratched their head. What does that mean? Who can you call at 2 a.m. in the morning, and who can call you at 2 a.m.? And of course, typically it's very few people, if not zero. And I said, you might not think of it this way, but that is actually a discipleship question. Who are your 2 a.m. friends? And those are the guys that are in your life. And most guys are going to answer family, and that's great. But I'd say, we can't always pick and choose our biological family, but we can pick and choose our spiritual family. I would encourage missionaries to recognize the spiritual input of close friends like that. And I just personally, I love the discipleship platform for that, where it's a mutual growth process. It's not, notice I'm not saying mentoring. With Jesus and his 12, it was a lot of mentoring, but Jesus, was God. So, but when I disciple guys, Martin, I learn from you every time we talk, and I pray the same is true the other way around, that it's a mutually beneficial relationship. And if we rob ourselves of having those kind of relationships, I think we do so at our own risk.
How do you, as a pastor, I mean, You say, who's your 2 a.m. Friend guy? If I would ask the same to people in church, I hope they all say, well, that's the pastor. I can always call him at 2 a.m. I can always call him at 2 a.m.
Yeah. And hopefully that is true, right?
Yeah, I mean, that should be a huge compliment if everybody says that in your church. But on the other hand, I mean, you're the pastor, and if every other night you get woken up at 2 a.m., I mean, that's not, yeah, you're never going to do that for 10 years. You're never going to survive that. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, again, we'd be doing ourselves a disservice as pastors if we in any way perpetuated that persona that I am your 2 a.m. person. In fact, we want to say just the opposite. Jesus himself spent 30 years preparing and then 3 years pushing away crowds in a way that the crowds, the thousands wanted to follow him, but the things he said, and he made it hard for them. And I think as missionaries, as pastors, we need to be cautious to not to push people away, but to say, I am not always your guy. You need to develop disciples in your life. And unfortunately, we sometimes buy into our own press clippings and believe that we need to be that person. And of course, it feels great, right? Up until your wife leaves you because you get 2 a.m. calls every night.
Yeah, that's not good for your marriage if that happens every other night.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I think it's also or at least for me it is, if everybody is my friend, on one hand, that I should be flattered. On the other hand, if everybody would say, oh yeah, I'm a big fan of Martin, I would get suspicious. If I'm real friends with you, for instance,
you can tell me I'm balding.
Yeah,
and
that's the
I
thing.
Still love you, right?
That's the thing. I mean, and you can only do that with real friends.
Right.
You can be really into their face. This is what I think. What do you think about it? And you don't even have to agree on everything. I mean, that's even fine.
Yeah.
Which is actually even better. It makes you sharper. It makes you more agile. It makes you think about stuff. So if everybody says, "Oh yeah, I agree with you," and you're my 2 a.m. guy.
Yeah.
That on one hand, it might feel like a compliment. On the other hand, I would say, well, if you're everybody's 2 a.m. friend, I'm not sure if that's a compliment.
Yeah, it could be a degree of neediness going on there, or enablement, or
yeah. So, I mean, we've got people knocking on our door literally at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
But thank God it doesn't happen too often.
And I work hard to not have too many 2 a.m. people because I'll pretend I'm not home.
Yeah, that works.
just to be honest, it's tough. I am not saying it's easy, and that's why I think the discipleship platform is so important. You can really only disciple so many people. If you're Christ, you could handle 12, and even he lost one.
Yeah.
So it is a tough, lifelong. It took him 3 years. Granted, Jesus had a lot of paradigms to shift, but switching from the Old Testament covenant to the New Testament was pretty huge. But for us, discipleship is a long, messy, invasive, difficult, yet glorious legacy-leaving methodology that I believe Christ set up for us on purpose. I've often said, I think Christ's methodology was almost as important as his message. And of course, his message being the gospel, which is what we preach adamantly, which is fantastic. Crucifixion and the resurrection and salvation through faith alone is fantastic. That's his message. And yet discipleship was what he spent his public ministry mostly doing. There's a fantastic passage in John 17, I think it is, in that long pastoral prayer of Christ where he's praying to his Father just before the crucifixion. There's a really interesting verse in there where Jesus said to the Father, he said, I have finished the work you have given me to do. And we kind of just read that over and gloss right by it and think, well, that's great. Of course he has. He's Jesus. But when you think of the timing of when he said that, it was before the cross. It was before the crucifixion. And here he is telling the Father, and we know Jesus doesn't lie, I have finished the work you've given me to do, God. And so you ask, what was that work? Well, you read a couple verses down and he explains that. It is discipling the disciples that God gave him. And so that was so important, evidently, to the Father and to Jesus, that Jesus discipled these men, that he mentioned that in that long prayer. And I think we miss out on that as pastors. We equate discipleship with teaching, which is good stuff, obviously. We equate discipleship with academic programs or impartation of knowledge. And I think, like Christ's life, it was a lot messier than that. It's walking with men. It's life on life. It's letting them see your house, whether it's 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. It's letting them get into your life so much. And what I found, Martin, on the mission field, it actually took some really wise men in Africa to teach me that we go to the mission field, or we become pastors thinking we're going to win the world. And the biggest thing often for missionaries is, I'm going to evangelize. And the scriptures rarely call us, and I challenge people to look this up, it rarely calls us to evangelize. It calls us to disciple people. It calls us to be friends to people. It calls us to the golden rule. It calls us to putting others first, thinking of others before ourselves. That's discipleship, and that's not teaching. And so when we get to the mission field, or when we're a pastor, we think I need to evangelize and convert the world, and it's all about evangelization. Evangelization, in my understanding, is a part of discipleship. Discipleship is making friends of the lost, befriending them, not to make them a convert, but to truly be their friend, because we love them and we want to see them come into the kingdom of heaven. But that's messy. When we invite the lost into our home, their kids might swear, they might smell like smoke, they might drink stuff that we don't drink, they might talk about politics, they might vote differently than we do, but that's discipleship. And until we wade into that, the depth of disciple making in that way, I think we really do rob ourselves of some of the beauty that happens in the midst of that. And then, God willing, at some point, as we share God stories with them and they come to see something in us, preferably the Spirit that they want, that they don't have, they will give their lives to Christ, and then we help them become a disciple maker themselves. And that multiplication process, often we see good addition in church, but not so much multiplication. Addition is where we invite people to church and they get saved, and then they learn about Jesus for the rest of their lives in church. Multiplication is having them come in and sending them out. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, if our only job would be evangelism, I mean, how can you evangelize if the discipleship part is not there? I mean, that for me, it feels weird. We invite homeless people over to our place. They even sleep at our place. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't always work out. Some of them really smell. Mm-hmm. Some of them walk out of a place. We trust them, so they sleep in our house. Some of them are abusing that part of trust. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It happens. It's part of the job. Yep. On the other hand, if I would go to one of those people and start evangelizing with them, just straight from the start, that would never work. I mean,
and certainly if we are modeling our life after Christ, if there's not a degree of risk and danger and sacrifice, I'm not sure that we're truly following Christ. Not just his methodology, but his whole life example. It is, when Christ's reputation was on his line, even his disciples said, Jesus, tone it down. Can't you see that the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the religious leaders, the respected elders of the day, are being offended by this? And evidently he was okay with that. He was answering to a higher calling. But in no way am I saying, if you do this, if you follow and in Christ's footsteps exactly like this, it's going to be rainbows and unicorns. In fact, it's typically quite the opposite. The internal blessings, the spiritual blessings and the life blessings and the broader purpose than myself blessings are incredible. There's nowhere better to be on the planet this side of heaven than following Jesus as tightly and closely, as sacrificially as we possibly can. And of course, the enemy and commercials and television and car dealers all say, no, real joy, real purpose, real fulfillment is pursuing the world and those things. But it's interesting when pastors and missionaries give their lives, they know this. Again, we know it cognitively, but often we get burned out because I think we try to do it on our own. And that's why I think discipleship is so important, both for our sake, for the disciplers' sake, as well as the disciplees. It's a mutually beneficial thing. It'd be an interesting study. I don't think I've read any books of, did Jesus need his 12 disciples? I've never studied it, but I've pondered that before. Obviously he prayed about it all night, at least, before he selected some of his disciples. And so God was evidently telling him to get those disciples, but did he need those disciples? Somehow in God's economy, Christ himself needed 12 men to walk around and follow him for him to be the Christ that God called him to be the man that God called him to be. And so if we think that's weakness on Christ's part, take it up with God, I guess, right?
Yeah, and the other funny thing that was also the verse that you said. Jesus said that he finished the work that the Father gave him. Mm-hmm. What I also found interesting in that verse, that it's called work. It's not God gave him a hobby, or God gave him something nice to do, or God gave him... No, it's work.
Great insight, Martin.
And God gave him... So it's more than just a hobby. It's the same. I mean, when we, not Jesus, but when we as humans ate the apple in paradise, one of the curses that we got, that we shall work for the rest of our life and sweat as pigs, I'm afraid. So for me, work is all, it connects. Work for me doesn't sound like fun. But for Jesus, it was work. Or the Father, God gave Jesus work. So Jesus worked, and I bet he sweated. It wasn't always fun. He had a really rough time. It took him years and years of studying. Just the same with you and me. I mean, we can do whatever we want, but we have to school first. We have to go to school first, and then we have to start our work. And for Jesus, it was the same. He had to go to an earthly school first. He had to go to the temple and read God's word. And he used it a lot in order to do the work that God gave him. And that I also found interesting. And a part of work is also trying to surround you with fellow team members, I guess. To talk with them. Hey, how am I doing? How do you think I'm doing? Am I still doing the good stuff or not? And even in work, you've got your days off. In the US, the system is a bit different, but in the Netherlands, we get 22 days per year off, paid leave.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And why don't we, as missionaries, we don't, for one or the other reason, a lot of them don't do that. If they do take time off, it's for a retreat or for a, some sort of seminar stuff. But with work also comes get days off.
Or at the very least, to be open to the Lord telling you to do that. Yeah. I mean, did Mother Teresa take a day off? Did Jesus take a day off? He certainly took hours alone and purposely got away from the crowd. So I think each person will be called to take time off differently. But I think there's a lot more people that God wants to take more time off than they are because of the constructs or the expectations of their organization or or themselves. And I can't. I'm working for Jesus. I can't take time off. Well, even in time off, evidently, and Christ models that for us, there is benefit.
That's the thing. I mean, did Jesus take time off? I guess he did. I can imagine, it's not in the Bible, that Jesus said to one of his disciples, you know what, just let's go fishing for today. I mean, the sun is shining. Why don't we just go fishing for a day? And that's also some sort of discipleship. Take a day off. Enjoy nature. Enjoy what God gave you. Do that together with your brother or sister. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Before he started his public ministry, he took a 40-day vacation in the wilderness, right?
Yeah. I mean, and
how did that work out for him?
Yeah. I mean, and I can't imagine that he was 24/7 praying, stuff like that. I can imagine that he just sat in the wilderness and sometimes just wandered off in some sort of way.
Yeah.
Enjoyed the view.
Yeah. And maybe that's where that comes from. You know, we pastors, we look at, before he started his ministry, he took 40 days in the wilderness, but that's where he had the temptations of Satan. So the lesson is never take time off, right?
Oh, that's where it comes from.
Yeah,
that's a great
where that
thought.
comes from. And I don't mean to get back to what you were talking about earlier in regards to Christ's 30 years of education, if you will. You know, he was basically homeschooled. He, I think, would have gone to the local synagogue and listened to the Torah, the Old Testament stuff. But his main education was listening, obviously, to the Father. But the beauty of discipleship, the great thing about discipleship is some of the best disciple makers I have had the blessing, the privilege of working alongside were brand new believers. And they did not know all the answers to the word. And they would go to their friends and start saying, listen to what the Lord did for me. And their friends would say, well, what about this? And why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And they'd say, I have no idea. I'll find that out for you and get back to you. And so that mutual learning process, it teaches teachability. And then they would, run back to me and ask me the question. Sometimes I'd know the answer, but sometimes I'd have to go to my disciplers and say, help, or look it up. And, but that humble sharing of discipleship, that's the cool thing about it, because it is one-on-one typically, or one-on-two, one-on-three. It's okay. If I'm up in the pulpit and somebody asks me a question and I'm the pastor and I don't know the answer, I might get my pay docked or something. But as a one-on-one friend, we can learn together. We can say, what a fantastic question. Let's go in the Word and find that out together. And it really is, as a pastor, and I don't mean that we shouldn't be 2 a.m. friends to everyone, but it really frees us up when I go to the mission field, rather than trying to win over, convert, proselytize the entire nation. What I'm looking for is a few men of peace. And it really frees me up to find the men that God has for me. Jesus prayed about it. He found 12. If you created the universe, you might be able to pull that off. But if you find 2 or 3, you're doing really well. And you pour deep into those men. And then early on, as early as the Lord leads you to, have an expectation that they would do the same with others. And that multiplication process, then eventually you'll see much more fruit. And it really frees you up to pour into those men closely. And I'd encourage that for pastors as well, whether it's your elders or your deacons or whatever kind of ecumenical business you're in, to pour deep into the men closest to you and then have that expectation of them. That's what I mean by discipleship.
And with that, we come to the end of our podcast. We want to say thanks to Kent for our time online.
Thank you so much, Martin.
And we want to say thanks to everybody who listened through this ordeal. You survived. You've made it. Please do like, subscribe, follow, or whatever, and talk to you soon.
Amen.
Thank you for listening to the Missionaries Podcast. For more information about this podcast and how you can help us, visit www.emmy.pel. God bless, and keep up the great work for His glory.